Welcome to the Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore. It is Saturday, June the 27th, 2020.
Donald Trump is playing pretend again, saying he's the one to take on China. They can't wait. They know who Donald Trump is. Weak, corrupt, ridiculed. China beats him every time. No matter what he says, China's got his number. Trump even begged Chinese leader Xi to help him win re-election. Like a dog. Trade negotiations? China won. Trump's tariffs? They laughed as Trump hit American families with higher taxes. Trump's trade war? Farms and small businesses went bankrupt. China's military? Expanding without American leadership in the region. President Xi? Trump rolls over for China's president every time. Is it Ivanka's secret deals in China? Is it the $250 million debt Trump owed the Bank of China? It doesn't matter, because when it comes to Trump, China can't lose. The Lincoln Project is responsible for the content of this advertising.
They run phenomenal ads, they are anti-Trumpers, and they definitely want to get rid of him from the White House at the ballot box this November. But what about the Lincoln Project and their agenda beyond that, and some of the players involved? A look at some of them and a bit more context around the Lincoln Project next. Welcome back.
The most deceptive, lying president in history finally told the truth. Somehow, it was more shocking than all his deceptions.
When you do testing to that extent, you're going to find more people, you're going to find more cases. So I said to my people, slow the testing down, please.
Slow the testing down? Slow down our chance to save tens of thousands of lives. Slow down our understanding of where COVID is and how it's spreading. Slow down the steps to reopen the economy. Every single expert told him to test more and test faster. And now we know his response.
Slow the testing down, please.
That's why this November, more than ever, the choice is clear. It's America or Trump.
That was from the Lincoln Project, one of their many excellent ads that go after Donald Trump in no uncertain terms. The Democrats could learn a lot from the Republicans, and especially the Republicans who message like this. These are disaffected Republicans I'm talking about, and they formed the Lincoln Project, something that was developed in 2019 and principally headed by the likes of Rick Wilson, Steve Schmidt, and George Conway, amongst others. These are Republicans who either are still Republicans or actually no longer Republicans. Steve Schmidt has formally left the Republican Party. George Conway calls himself a conservative, which he is, and Rick Wilson would call himself the same. He does not identify with the Republican Party, nor do many of these individuals. But it is helpful to look a bit closer at some of the people involved in the Lincoln Project and who they are. Henry Kissinger once said, "In politics, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, just permanent interests." And as far as the Lincoln Project is concerned, there is at least a shared interest that they have with the Democrats in this country, which is obviously to make sure that Donald Trump is voted out of the White House this November 3rd. That is the shared interest, and certainly would be a permanent interest for both of those parties, at least in this short term, if you will. But if and when, and I think it's just a case of when, this year, Donald Trump is unceremoniously booted out of the White House by the voters this November, and then after January the 20th of 2021, what will the Lincoln Project's agenda be then? Because let's make no mistake about this. The Lincoln Project is pushing its own agenda. The Lincoln Project is interested in returning to a Republican Party that is full of neocons and full of conservatives. The Lincoln Project does not give a rat's ass about Democratic interests. Obviously, they're Republicans. All they're interested in is making sure that Donald Trump is out of office come January of next year. And obviously, before that, making sure that he is voted out of office this year. But that doesn't mean these folks are Democrats. They may champion, obviously, the Democratic nominee, which will become official in August, Joe Biden. They're obviously championing him. But if you watch and look at their ads, most of their ads are focused squarely on Donald Trump and rarely on any other Republican beyond him. You've just heard 2 of those ads from the Lincoln Project that deal directly with Trump. And that's a good idea, but Trump is hardly the only problem here in the United States when it comes to the Republicans. This did not begin with Trump. Trump is a symptom of a system and of a Republican Party that has been heading this way for 50 or 60 years. And it is during those 50 or 60 years prior to the advent of Donald Trump that Republicans such as George Conway, such as Steve Schmidt, such as Rick Wilson, and others made their names, supported policies that hurt the country, supported policies that hurt black people and poor people, supported policies that absolutely were a benefit to the rich. And that's the thing that I think people lose sight of. Steve Schmidt was someone who was not a friend of Social Security. He supported lessening its influence or getting rid of it. Steve Schmidt also, of course, was the campaign manager for John McCain. And while John McCain was decent in some ways, he was very indecent in others when it came to policies that hurt many black and brown people and many poor whites for that matter. John McCain was a hawk. John McCain was somebody who, while a war hero and someone who had some compassion in his final vote, one of his last votes, was to vote against Mitch McConnell wanting to get rid of Obamacare. Still was someone whose policies were anathema to most people in the country. McCain was someone who was against the Dr. King holiday and fought it for a long time while he was in the House of Representatives for Arizona, in his district. Rick Wilson, a Republican political strategist and consultant who regularly has time on CNN and at times MSNBC, was somebody who ran an ad against Max Cleland, a Vietnam War veteran who had had 3 of his limbs shot off, and ran an ad that was saying in 2002 that Max Cleland, the Democratic senator or House member, I forget which he was, who was a vet who had 3 of his limbs shot off, lost 3 of his limbs on the battlefield, that Max Cleland was somehow more dangerous to America than Osama bin Laden. That was an ad created by Rick Wilson. The same Rick Wilson who is part of the Lincoln Project. George Conway, the husband of Kellyanne Conway, who of course works inside the Trump administration, was, and I think still is, a corporate lawyer, has always been someone who has supported the corporations and done legal work for them. So you have a number of people whose interests, while their interests dovetail with interests of many other people who are Democrats, and that interest being to make sure that Donald Trump is voted out on November 3rd. Yet behind the scenes, their own personal political histories suggest something that are in great opposition to democratic principles and Democrats whose platforms are completely opposite from the kinds of things that Steve Schmidt, George Conway, and Rick Wilson stand for. Now look, they have run ads to very effective acclaim. Those ads are probably the best that are running against Trump. But there are very few ads that they run against the Republican infrastructure that brought about Donald Trump. There are very few ads about the Republican senators that backed Donald Trump during the impeachment sham trial that occurred back in January of this year. There's not been any ads attacking the 52 Senate Republicans who have sided with Donald Trump and who allowed him to continue on in office. There has not been any attack ads from the Lincoln Project, to the best of my knowledge, that hone in on Republicans in the House. There have not been any attack ads dealing with the Republican state legislatures that have held up all kinds of immoral things in their own customs, that have sanctioned these things and that have blocked and prevented Democratic majorities from doing their jobs in state houses all over the country, whether it's Democratic governors such as Tony Evers in Wisconsin, or whether it is other Democrats in power like the governor from Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, who has been sabotaged on a number of occasions by the Republican legislature. All of whom in Michigan support Trump. These Republican legislatures support Trump. They behave like Trump does. They dance to his beat. So where are the ads from the Lincoln Project attacking those legislatures? I think it's pretty easy to point to Donald Trump as the problem, and he is. He most certainly is. But what on earth about the Republican legislatures in at least 33 different states across this country who have been more damaging on a local and state level, arguably, than Donald Trump has been? Donald Trump is in the federal government, and while it's unquestioned that he and his policies have destroyed this country's fabric, and his Muslim ban has been absolutely a racist ban, and his ban against transgender people serving in the military has been an absolute disgrace, and his attempts to get rid of Obamacare, even now, are an absolute travesty, as are his continued racism. Is disgraceful. All of it is. The Republican state legislatures have been doing some unholy things in state governments all across this land. They have absolutely gerrymandered and handcuffed Democrats in power, particularly governors. And the courts, which consist of a lot of Republican judges, Donald Trump this week, Mitch McConnell, with Mitch McConnell's help, put through his 200th federal court judge. All Republicans. Where are the ads from the Lincoln Project on that? Where are the ads from the Lincoln Project on all of these Republican senators who've been voting in line with Donald Trump 95, 96, 97% of the time? And if you say that President Abraham Lincoln was this quote-unquote great emancipator with the Emancipation Proclamation, and I spoke about this a week or so ago when we talked about Juneteenth. If you're going to say that about Lincoln, and he being the great emancipator of enslaved black people in this country, then where are your ads against Senator Rand Paul, who is holding up the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in the Senate? Where are your ads, Lincoln Project, about that? I hear you right now, some of you out there, saying, well, they're Republicans. What do you expect? Well, my answer to that is a whole lot more. That's what I expect. Because in my view, with this Republican Party, with this Trump Party, you can't just be about going halfway when it comes to this lot in the White House and across the country. Running candidates who've got guns in their ads. Running candidates who are saying racist things in their ads. Running candidates who are threatening to body slam their opponents. To step on their opponents with spikes in their shoes. In the bottoms of their shoes. You have got to condemn and distance yourself from the entire stinking, rotten, criminal lot of this Republican Party. Trump is the easy target. The harder target, the more challenging target, is to go after the Republicans in the Senate, in the House, in state houses across the country, the state legislatures, and all the offices that Republicans hold. If you claim that you want a different Republican Party, then claim it and reclaim the values of what the Republican Party used to be prior to the 1960s. A party that actually did believe in a sense of fairness, in a sense of justice, before the 1960s. What the Lincoln Project people want to do is go back to Ronald Reagan. That's what they want to do, in my opinion. Ronald Reagan was the same Ronald Reagan who, in 1981, or rather in his 1980 campaign, made his first stop, that of Philadelphia, Mississippi, gave a speech there where he talked about states' rights. Now, anybody who's familiar with Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Neshoba County knows that in 1964, and we recently had the anniversary of it, 3 civil rights workers were murdered by the Klan. All they were doing is trying to register people to vote. 2 white men from the North and 1 black man from the South. His name is James Chaney. The other 2 men, the 2 white men, were Mickey Schwerner and Andrew Goodman. Study all 3 of those civil rights workers. They were murdered in Neshoba County. They were murdered in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1964. And in 1980, just 16 years later, Ronald Reagan went to that exact same spot in that town, in that area, and campaigned about states' rights. That was his first campaign speech on the stump. It was very clear what message he was sending. And while Steve Schmidt may have been a teenager when that happened, may have been just 10 years old when that happened, and Rick Wilson may have been maybe a teenager when that happened, and George Conway may have been even younger when that happened, I've never heard any of them denounce Ronald Reagan and his policies, which have, quite frankly, set up Donald Trump's entrance on this stage to begin with. Donald Trump was around in the 1980s, and he was just as racist then as he is now. Donald Trump was around in the 1990s, and he was just as racist then as he is now. There was no Lincoln Project around back in the 1990s or in the 2000s. And yes, Donald Trump was not in power in politics in the 2000s. But for several years before he decided to run for president, he was attacking President Obama, saying that President Obama was not from the United States, saying that President Obama was of the Muslim faith, lying about his faith. Nothing wrong with being Muslim. What's wrong about what Donald Trump said is that he was lying. I didn't hear from Steve Schmidt then. Where was Rick Wilson back then? Where was George Conway back then? I didn't hear any of the people at the Lincoln Project, at least the people who are now part of that project, make any objection to the racism of Donald Trump in 2012. And what was all of this about the GOP strategy to look towards getting more Latinos and black people into their realm? Many people have already forgotten that 2013 memo by Reince Priebus, then the RNC chairman, who is saying in a 100-page report that we've got to do a whole lot better with black and Latino voters. We've got to rebrand ourselves and show that we care. And that Jack Kemp said that you've got to make sure that you care and show that you care before voters trust you and believe you. Well, we've seen where that memo has gone. Omar Moore here, reminding you that you can get the Politicrat podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, please. And you can follow me on Twitter at @thepopcorn, REEL. You can also follow the podcast itself on Twitter at @the_politicrat. That's at @the_politicrat. Welcome back. There is a lot of hypocrisy to go around. With the Lincoln Project, as great as their ads have been, and I love their ads, they need to, I think, broaden their attacks on the Republican Party in general. I submit that what the Lincoln Project really wants to do with their agenda once Donald Trump is out of the White House is to refashion and reshape the Republican Party. And they have every right to do that. They know that. They know that the Republican Party is no more and that it is extinct. And that Donald Trump himself has destroyed it. But the party itself has allowed itself to be destroyed. The policies of the party were Trump's policies even before Trump came in. Donald Trump himself has no ideology at all. The only thing Donald Trump cares about is Donald Trump. The only thing that Donald Trump cares about beyond himself is money and his family members, at least the family members he likes. His niece would not be one of them at this point. She has a book coming that Donald Trump is fighting to get kept out of bookstores. Good luck with that. He tried that with John Bolton. John Bolton is another repugnant figure that I am not going to waste this episode talking about. The fact of the matter is that the Lincoln Project folks want to refashion the Republican Party back to where it was, the Reagan days, which were destructive for a great many people in the country. What the Lincoln Project wants to get back to is the days of the neocon era, of the George W. Bush era, of the George H.W. Bush era. All of these guys like Lee Atwater. When Lee Atwater was running racist ads about Willie Horton for George H.W. Bush's campaign in 1988, there was no objections from Rick Wilson, Steve Schmidt, or George Conway. Now, granted, they were all relatively young. I mean, they were all around 20 or younger. So, yeah, maybe they didn't have that kind of profile. But have they spoken on these issues in the intervening 40 years? I've not heard them. In the 30 plus years since those racist ads and the Lee Atwater strategy, which he himself basically on his deathbed confessed were racist. I've not heard any of the Republicans, or ex-Republicans for that matter, in the Lincoln Project say anything about Lee Atwater's racism. Now, these were people in the party way before Trump ever got into the party. The Nixon strategy in the 1960s, the Southern strategy, was explicitly based on the racism of white people in the South and all over the United States. Richard Nixon was someone who was unfailingly racist, unfailingly so. And the whole notion that somehow Nixon was not in that camp is just not true. And the Republicans or ex-Republicans who are in the Lincoln Project want to return to the era of Reagan. They want to return to that era. They certainly have a problem with racism today as it is, but they don't have a problem with the kind of racism espoused by the policies of Reaganism and Reaganomics. And Reagan speaking in Mississippi, in Philadelphia, talking about states' rights, in a state where, and in a town where 3 civil rights workers were murdered just 16 years before. There's no question that the Lincoln Project wants to return to a Republican Party that has a neocon flavor to it. There's no question that people like Nicole Wallace, who are on TV, want to return to that as well. She was part of the inner circle around the campaign of John McCain. A very same campaign of John McCain that was run by Steve Schmidt. The same campaign in which Nicole Wallace was chiefly responsible for bringing on and bringing in Sarah Palin as the vice presidential pick. That was before Nicole Wallace had what I'd call a falling out with Sarah Palin. Quite frankly, I think the Lincoln Project would probably be more comfortable going back to the era of John McCain, a foreign policy that was fierce and unyielding, one that was all about bombing Iran. Remember when McCain said this on a stage somewhere? Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. That's what he said. You can find that on YouTube. John McCain did have a couple of good moments. As I said earlier, one of them was when he voted down Mitch McConnell's plan to get rid of Obamacare. It was one of the final votes John McCain made defiantly against his own party. I believe it was back in 2017. One of the final votes he cast before he passed away. It was something that will live on for a long time. The other couple of things about John McCain that I found to be decent, other than obviously his service in Vietnam and staying there for at least 6.5 more years as a prisoner of war, when he probably could have been released earlier, are his message against a racist supporter of his, something that Donald Trump would never do these days, and also McCain's very generous ad. There's a campaign ad, actually, that McCain made back in 2008, on the night that Barack Obama became the first black person ever to win the nomination of either major political party. He did that in August of 2008. And this was the ad that John McCain released on that evening as Barack Obama was being nominated and had clinched the nomination for the Democratic Party for President of the United States.
Senator Obama, this is truly a good day for America. You know, too often the achievements of our opponents go unnoticed. So I wanted to stop and say, congratulations. How perfect that your nomination would come on this historic day. Tomorrow we'll be back at it. But tonight, Senator, a job well done. I'm John McCain, and I approve this message.
That is a decent ad. One of the better ads I've seen from a Republican in many years, quite frankly. There would be plenty of opportunities, of course, for someone in John McCain's position to absolutely have ignored that historic achievement. But there is some decency, and was some decency, in John McCain. He at least found it in himself to take a pause from the contentious campaigning. And I remember his campaign was quite contentious, had a lot of disarray in the background of it. But it was a symbol and signal of decency in the man. For him to come out and say, well done and congratulations. I mean, that tells you something, that someone in the Republican Party would do that. that will tell you a lot, quite frankly. Here is the audio of John McCain in October of 2008 telling a racist supporter, a white woman, probably a white woman in her late 50s, early 60s, who is a supporter of his. Listen to this. This is actually quite remarkable. This is John McCain. This is John McCain saying this. Listen to this.
About him, and he's an Arab. He is not.
No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you.
Now that was John McCain talking to a McCain supporter, a white woman, who was saying that Barack Obama was an Arab and he's not from here, repeating the lie that Donald Trump had facilitated, quite frankly, and that Fox News had been facilitating. And quite frankly, John McCain showed decency and took the microphone from her and said, no, he's a decent man, he's an American citizen, and he's someone I just have disagreements with. And that leadership is lacking now. It's lacking now. The Lincoln Project, I think, has some good intentions in terms of getting rid of Donald Trump from the White House this November at the ballot box. That is their stated aim and goal. But as I said earlier, what I believe their goal is beyond that is to remake the Republican Party into the party that it was when Ronald Reagan was in the White House, when George H.W. Bush was in the White House, and quite frankly, when George W. Bush is in the White House. A load of these people are neocons or conservatives who do not share the values of most people in the country. I think that is important to keep in mind. I think it's very important to keep that in mind. And I think it is worth noting that ads celebrating people who do the right thing, no matter which party they're in, is something to do. I think it's also important to realize that if the Lincoln Project wants to continue trying to build credibility with lots of people, and maybe even push some of them towards a Republican Party down the road at some point in the future, that they are going to have to repudiate the racism in the party, the racism that has plagued the Republican Party for 60 plus years. And not just with Donald Trump. What about looking at that 2013 100-page report from Reince Priebus, who ended up joining the Trump administration? They all went to the dark side, if you will, or the white side, more like it. And we can't forget these things. We can't forget these things. And I think what's happened is that we in America have a very, very short memory, particularly when it comes to politics. George W. Bush was a war criminal. In 2003, when he lied, and he sent Colin Powell to lie in front of the United Nations about weapons of mass destruction that the Iraqis did not have, that Saddam Hussein did not have, he put into motion a very dangerous outcome, a deadly outcome for hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and thousands of American military personnel. It was a war, an unholy war, quite frankly, an invasion that netted people like Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and others millions and billions of dollars. The Project for a New American Century crowd made buku dollars off of that invasion of Iraq. That is the truth. And George W. Bush was a disaster. Hurricane Katrina, Afghanistan, Iraq, wanting to cut Social Security, the whole Medicare Part B or whatever the heck it was, all of these things, just disastrous. No Child Left Behind. The Help America Vote Act was a disaster. The Patriot Act, a disaster. I know, Democrats voted for it too. Only Barbara Lee in the House said no to the Patriot Act. And that was just a few weeks after September 11th, 2001. George W. Bush's complete ignorance of September 11th, 2001, in terms of the ignorance of the dangers preceding it. The Presidential Daily Brief from August the 6th, 2001, which he barely even looked at. Bin Laden determined to strike inside the U.S. George W. Bush turned a blind eye and a deaf ear. And when the attacks came on September 11, 2001, George W. Bush really didn't do much. He was cowering, being shuttled from place to place. And it wasn't until near late at night that he made formal comments from the Oval Office. His handling of Hurricane Katrina was disastrous. The torture of Iraqis in Abu Ghraib was a human rights violation which should have definitely had him in The Hague. Donald Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, Paul Wolfowitz, among others, should have joined him, should be there, should have been there. None of them, including W., were ever sent to The Hague. Cheney also should be there. These days I see he's wearing a mask. Darth Vader with a mask. What's the world coming to? But my whole point of bringing up George W. Bush is that now, in 2020, there's this nostalgic goodness that some people in the country are somehow associating to a war criminal named W. It's unbelievable how many in the United States, at least a good portion, are reliving George Bush, George W., like he's some folk hero. When George W. Bush this month and last month put out statements that clearly were directed against Trump, people were throwing bouquets at George W. for saying something that we all knew was obvious. Sure, it's great to put out a statement, but we do not forget who you were either, who you are either. It's amazing how time changes people's perceptions, recollections, and memories of things, especially with George W. Bush, who should not be looked at as this great person. Now, look, he did great things in terms of the HIV/AIDS initiatives on the African continent to stem those and care for African children and have programs that would safeguard them and reduce the spread of HIV. Those things were good. It's one of the strongest things that George W. Bush did while he was in office. And let's not forget that he stole that office to begin with. I think you'll be shocked at the number of things that people forget about George W. Bush. And yet, when you see the Bushes and the Obamas together, when they were at John McCain's funeral in 2018 or 2017, whenever it was, whichever year it was, they were all buddy-buddy like peas in a pod. It was interesting, though, that there was a whole lot of backlash against Ellen DeGeneres last year for her friendship with George W., being seen with him at an NFL game in Dallas, sitting in a corporate box next to George W. Bush, watching the Dallas Cowboys down in Dallas. Ellen DeGeneres got all this heat for that. And I'm not saying that criticism shouldn't be leveled. I'm not saying that George W. Bush and Ellen can't be friends at the same time either. But what I am saying is, if you're going to criticize Ellen DeGeneres, then why are you fawning over George W. Bush when he puts out a statement against Trump? Because Trump's worse than him? They're all part of the same crooked straits. One begat the other. And Reagan begat them all, quite frankly. A system begat all of them, including Reagan and Nixon. And half these people are treasonous. Reagan was, Nixon was. Certainly Trump is. These people are traitors. I think it's easy for us to forget these things. I think it's easy for us to forget because we're in this moment of unprecedented peril in terms of the institutions in this country being destroyed by Donald Trump. In terms of the climate in this country being poisoned and toxified by Donald Trump. And so because we're so deeply enmeshed in that environment, in that moment, we tend to forget, and we forget the context around what we forget, which is that this did not just begin with Donald Trump. And that some of the people in the Lincoln Project who have cultivated these great ads are some of the very same people who have brought about the kinds of things for years that are not good for us and that have ultimately led to Donald Trump. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of The Politicrat. I'm Omar Moore.